Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Big Data London webinar. Today, we're looking at safe data provisioning. I'm Andy Steed, Content Director of Big Data London, and I'm joined today again by Mike Ferguson. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Andy. Good
and
to be here.
Steve Totman from Privitar. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
So yeah, these sessions are designed to be interactive, so please send in your questions throughout the two presentations, and I'll endeavour to ask as many as I possibly can at the end. Just a quick note of housekeeping. If you lose the stream at any point, you shouldn't, but if you do, just hit refresh on your browser and you'll jump straight back in. However, without further ado, I'd like to bring on our first presenter. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Andy. I'll just get myself up and running here. Oops. Okay, so all right, so the topic of today's presentation is accelerating safe data provisioning for analytics and machine learning. So what I want to talk about is the kind of rise of data and analytics in the boardroom and how that is done, driving a lot of sponsorship into analytics and machine learning and driving the need for more data, especially around areas like customer engagement. And then what that's doing to analytical activity today. And whilst all that's going on, the requirement around legal requirement and in terms of being able to fulfill obligations on data privacy in this analytical environment, and how companies are struggling with that given the operating model that they're currently operating in, and what the kind of requirements would be needed to try and address that. And then how that could be potentially enabled before I'll hand over to Steve. So I've used this slide on previous webinars at Big Data London, but basically there's no question that the promise of data and analytics is there these days in order to be sort of central to the data-driven enterprise. And if you look at some of the surveys around, I took this one, a 2020 survey this year from the Institute of Business Value, which shows that CEOs in the boardroom now really, some of the leading CEOs, but even different categories of CEOs you can see here with the kind of aspirational, who are the kind of laggards, and the torchbearers, who are the the kind of leading edge CEOs. That without a doubt, there's enormous investment going into artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automation. And so, I think we're now obviously in an era where it's not a case of trying to justify the need for data and analytics in the boardroom anymore. It's absolutely the case that it's recognized as strategically important. And if you look at some of the surveys that I did, this is the Fourth Industrial Revolution survey from late last year, which showed that the focus for 2020 was absolutely dominated by the need to improve customer experience. And I think that's probably become even more acute in this current climate. But given that that's the case, there's seen a huge demand, pushing to get more and more data about customers to try and improve customer engagement, and looking at all kinds of internal and external data sources where that may come from. And so we've seen, machine generated data on online customer behavior, for example, clickstream. We've seen perhaps device usage for consumer-based devices to understand customer usage of those kind of products. We've seen human-generated data such as opinions around social networks and things like that, or inbound email. Again, talking about opinions about products and brands to try and add that into the picture, and anything else you can get your hands on, particularly to do with B2B customers, with a lot of open government data associated with businesses that's freely available to download and add to what you already know. And so we've seen, with all this data, we've seen over the last several years, I guess, an explosion of new analytical workloads running on different platforms, whether it be data science, either on Hadoop or on cloud storage with Spark. You could be doing streaming analytics on real-time data, whether that's Clickstream or IoT data, for example. You could be in graph analysis to understand additional customer relationships and even influencers within prospects and social networks that marketing people could target over and above what's going on in classic data warehousing, which is looking at transactional activity. So many companies have kind of created this analytical ecosystem, if you like, made up of multiple analytical systems, some of which could be on-prem, some in the cloud, handling different kinds of analytical workloads. And no question today, all of it is available in the cloud, but for most companies, we're in a hybrid state, and some of this data in data centers and some in one or even multiple clouds to do these different kinds of analytical workloads. And so I guess, what's happened over the last few years is the operating model is definitely distributed. We're now dealing with data that's in your data center or data centers. It's in multiple clouds, and it's even out at the edge. And so the sprawl of data, if you like, is spreading out, and the ingestion of all of this new data in order to be able to help produce the insights to improve customer value, for example, or to improve customer experience, is coming in to a variety of different data stores, some of which could be NoSQL, some relational, some just cloud storage or Hadoop, and they themselves could be on one or more clouds or in the data center or both. And so, if you like, the ingestion and desire to get your hands on all this data and then ingesting it in it is turning out to be not ingestion necessarily into a single space, but into multiple different places. And so, there's been a lot of challenges around this sprawling distributed data landscape, people finding it, harder to just find the data, to manage data, govern the data, to find sensitive data across this distributed landscape in order to be able to protect it, for example. And of course, given that we're now in an era of legislative regulations, GDPR here in Europe, or CCPA as one of the states in the US, it does seem to be the US is going to implement 50 different versions of their GDPR over there, which is incredible complexity. But we see other parts of the world as well following with some kind of equivalent. And so if you operate in multiple countries, you're potentially liable or potentially obligated to be compliant with multiple different legislation in different jurisdictions around the world. And if you're going to remain compliant, it's very important even in an analytical environment. And obviously we're trying to avoid data breaches and protect data such that if there is a data breach, at least the impact may be minimized. And we've seen all kinds of headlines like the ones that you see in front of you here, that don't do any company any good in terms of brand damage and all of that. And certainly the evidence, I picked this survey up on the internet, just looking around, where the impact of a data breach is pretty severe. Not only can it affect your your brand, people could take legal action, your share price could tank as a result of that, customer confidence can go, as you can see this survey indicating that as many as 83% of US customers in this case would stop spending for several months, and 21% would never come back. And they would blame the company first rather than a hacker, for example. And so when you look at this analytical environment of multiple data stores on one or more clouds, you kind of think about it and you think, well, we're obligated to protect the data, but as data spreads out across all of this landscape, it's becoming harder and harder to even know where the sensitive data is. And so, being able to govern data privacy is becoming a significant challenge. And so we look at this and we've got to somehow overcome it, in terms of the potential impact on your organization. How many data stores do you have on Azure or AWS or on Google Cloud? Are they relational? Is it cloud storage? How many buckets are you using on cloud storage? How many instances of the same data are sitting in cloud storage? What about relational databases in the cloud? We now got data warehouses on the cloud. Similarly, of course, in the data center, we still have things like data warehouses. We still have even Hadoop systems running in a data center. We've got NoSQL databases being used for very high velocity data ingestion, being written into something like Cassandra, for example, in a very rapid way to capture that data, perhaps from IoT devices or clickstream. And we've still also got data at the edge that even could be being stored at the edge now that we have edge databases that have emerged in the industry today. And so companies dealing with a kind of distributed landscape, trying to really accelerate and shorten the time to value to leverage insights from new kinds of analytical workloads, whilst at the same time obligated to govern data privacy across this landscape and know where everything is, so that we don't step on any landmines and cause problems for your organization. So there's kind of like differing needs here. The boardroom putting huge pressure, in order to accelerate and deliver value, particularly around customer engagement. But customer data, of course, is subject to data privacy legislation like GDPR, and therefore we're obligated to protect it. And whilst all of these workloads are kicking off to be able to analyze all kinds of data associated with the customer in order to piece together a richer picture about customers, in order to drive new value and achieve those kind of goals. So it's kind of opposing forces almost. And you kind of look at, well, how are companies currently tackling this problem? Well, there's a myriad of different technologies that are out there that companies are using to try and deal with information protection. Everything from operating level security, could be different levels of authority on databases or database privileges. We may have encryption and dynamic data masking in databases. We've got similar things people looking at on Hadoop systems, perhaps encrypted data on HDFS, for example. And we've got unstructured documents as well as document databases with JSON data and things like that. We're trying to do things at the application level, which could be specific to the administration screens associated with a particular package, like an Oracle Business Suite or SAP or Salesforce or something like that. Then you've got stuff at the firewall level, at user interface device, and all the way up. And so when you look at this, it's kind of so many places, and you're trying to coordinate so many administrators across all of this in order to remain compliant. And it's hard. It's very, very hard. And not only that, the vast majority of these things that we're doing are more associated with access security than they are necessarily with privacy. And so there's probably a bias towards access security in that regard. And of course, they're not the same. And yet we're obligated. So then people say, well, in an analytical environment, the best way to do this is put it all in a data lake, and then give everybody self-service tools, and then let them, be able to accelerate reduce the time to value by, getting at this data themselves and being able to produce the insights from various different analytical projects. But again, the difference here is you're still obligated. If you put data into this kind of environment, you're still obligated to be able to protect it and uphold, your compliance with different regulations around the world. And so if you just put data in a data lake like this as just kind of raw data and give everybody self-service, The danger is it turns into the Wild West. I mean, and before you know it, you're in a situation where everybody's storming ahead on their respective analytical workload with data, testing out, doing training models and all the rest of it. And yet, you've got this lurking responsibility in the background, where you've got to be able to make sure you are absolutely protecting the data to, especially around customer, as we saw with customer engagement being such a high priority, that we got to make sure that that's all protected. And so test data, everything else is all got to be handled here. So you look at the requirements in an analytical environment for data privacy, there's a number of things. I mean, the obvious requirement is if you're going to make data available to people in different parts of the business, it's got to be safe. You've got to know that before you're going to start working with it, it's already safe. And so in that sense, you want to make know that as data flows to different departments for different analytical workloads, whether those analyses are taking place in the cloud or the data center, we've got to know that safety is there, so that there's no inadvertent use of data that would result in non-compliance with these legislation that we have to be compliant with in various jurisdictions around the world. And so, when you look at this, you could easily be overwhelmed by it. I mean, if you look at the challenge ahead here, I mean, if you look something like the top left, now if I start with the data landscape, we're now dealing with data in motion, so streaming data. We're dealing with data in multiple databases that could be sources to analytical environments, or indeed analytical data stores. So you could be NoSQL databases here. We could have just files sitting in file systems. We could have analytical relational databases for data warehouses, for example, and data marts, whether those are on the cloud or on premises. We have different kinds of file systems, like Hadoop file system, as well as other file systems that you're currently using. We've got all of the different locations and all of that as well. Looking at the users, we've got different kinds of users, from business users through to power users like database administrators or data scientists who really working with data in anger and have got access to databases with very high privilege levels. And we've got to manage development, test, and production, whether that's on premises again or in the clouds, and deal with that kind of environment. We've got to monitor any changes that could result in issues that, and we've got to somehow down towards the bottom be able to try and manage risk by creating policies and processes and testing and whatnot. And there's different kinds of policies, whether those be access security or data privacy policies, and we've got to have then a mechanism to enforce this across this distributed landscape. So you look at this and you kind of think this is like trying to climb Mount Everest. I mean, it's a significant challenge. I mean, just doing this in the analytical world is hard enough, never mind in the operational world. So there's a lot of questions you got to ask here. Things like, well, what data have you defined as sensitive data? And if it is customer related, I mean, there's clearly sensitive data that's indicated by the legislation. And kind of the next question is, well, where is it? I mean, if we don't know where it is, we've got no chance of being able to protect it. And how does it move? With all these pipelines being built by data scientists, by data engineers, whether they're in departments or in IT, how does it move? How do we know that it's protected? And how are we currently enforcing that? Is it just that we just throw all the data in and give everyone access to it, or is it absolutely the case that we are currently protecting it? And do we have some knowledge of who accesses sensitive data and when do they do it, or is it not a who but a what that's accessing it? Is it an application, a script, or a Jupyter notebook that a data scientist is putting together? Is there any auditing mechanism of this? And is there any, what policies are in place, and how do you manage those policies? And if somebody needs to change the policies, does it have to be approved, and all those kinds of good things? There's a lot of stuff to think about here. And in the analytical world, we want a kind of, universal approach to this. We want some kind of way to be able to do this from a data privacy perspective across all of these data stores, irrespective of whether they're on the cloud or on premises or both. Which means that, we need to be able, in an analytical use case environment, we're looking to be able to protect data and enforce data privacy on ingestion. If we want to do it in real time, if we're doing it in batch, we want to process it then. If we're provisioning data into sandboxes for data scientists, we want to make sure that that data is safe, so that data scientists get a green light and can go ahead in the knowledge that they're still compliant and not inadvertently becoming non-compliant because of this. And even if the data is at rest across all of these environments, we need to make sure that that's the case. And if there's any testing, then again, we need to make sure that copies of data that are needed for testing, or subsets of data that are needed, all that is all dealt with and masked. And then if production data can't be used, we need some other way to sort of come up with some kind of synthetic data instead, without causing any issues around sensitivity, because if production data is too sensitive, couldn't potentially use it. So all of these need to be taken into consideration. And so I guess the question is, well, what would you do around that? How would you, if that's the requirement, how do we enable this? And I guess one of the key requirements here is we want centralized definition of data privacy policies and rules to software, and then some kind of universal data privacy management software that can then apply, if you like, those rules and policies to data, whether it's streaming or whether it's being processed in batch or sitting at rest in a range of different data stores in the cloud or multiple clouds, or in the data center, or even at the edge, and to make sure that privacy is enforced, rather than having to employ an army of administrators to try and do this on every single system or data store that's out there. Could we find a way to define it once and enforce it everywhere? And I think, increasingly, as the data landscape spreads out and sprawls out all the way into multiple clouds in the data center, the requirement is for the software to be able to manage that complexity, despite the fact that, whilst at the same time giving everyone a green light in order to be able to accelerate and shorten the time to value by using that data confidently to drive new insights from analytical workloads. And so I guess if you look at this without architecturally, again, this is a kind of slide that I've had up in previous Big Data London webinars, but with source data on the far left, ingesting that kind of data into a data lake and then building pipelines, or whether we're doing real-time pipelines even, to produce trusted data and then make that available to data warehouses and other kinds of data stores, or even straight to data science. What we're trying to do here is make sure that it's safe all the way through that journey. Safe on the ingestion, safe while it's in a data lake environment. Once we produce the trusted data, that's also safe. We can then take from that safe set of trusted data and bring it into other kinds of data stores or sandboxes to work on it in the confidence that it's still safe. And so that, there's no there's no loopholes, there's nothing that's been inadvertently missed, that would result in non-compliance. It's just, as it flows, still safe all the way through that kind of journey. And I suppose if we get into this whole pipeline business, taking data from ingested data and producing trusted data, we're seeing more and more of this idea of data ops and sort of component-based pipeline development. Well, if these pipelines are connecting to the edge, they're connecting to the data center, they're connecting to multiple clouds in order to get at the data they need, in order to be able to clean it and integrate it and produce trusted data assets. What we kind of like is there any way to introduce governance into the pipeline by just invoking data privacy services on demand? So that they're just a component in the pipeline, but at certain points in the pipeline, you can ensure that as the data is processed, that you're remaining compliant by leveraging such an on-demand service kind of capability, which means that people who are then using things like data fabric to be able to build these pipelines can then make use of on-demand data privacy services to be able to ensure that everything is compliant throughout the development process and also with the data that's produced from the pipeline. Or even if the pipeline's feeding an analytical model, then the analytical model is working on data that is protected and therefore no inadvertent violations as a result. And so, the components that we use in data ops kind of pipelines, we are various different kinds of components, whether those are ingestion components or transformation components or matching components, whatever. But we also need governance components, and within that, we need data privacy as a service that we can potentially use in order to ensure that we remain compliant as we go forward. And then if you're testing, even in a continuous testing environment like a CI/CD environment with data ops pipelines, we're then in a position to be able to test that privacy is enforced, and therefore that the pipelines that we're producing are indeed upholding compliance, and therefore giving us that that guarantee that the data is safe throughout its journey. And of course, obviously, can then put all this in containers and configure the runtime environment from all of these components. But we're doing that in the knowledge that data privacy is upheld. So kind of in conclusion then, I guess what I would say is that there's no question that there's kind of odd forces at play here. Without a doubt, data and analytics is central in the boardroom today. There's absolute eagerness, if not urgency, coming out of the boardroom to drive investment in data and analytics, especially in customer engagement. As we've seen, that's a hugely high priority. In addition to that, there's more and more data sources. And in addition to all of that, because there's so much more data coming in order to be able to build that bigger picture around a customer, we're ingesting it into potentially multiple data stores in a distributed computing environment. But because it's customer data, for example, we would absolutely need to still uphold data privacy to remain compliant with the obligations that we are signed up to, in everyday business today here in Europe or in other parts of the world that you may be operating. And so out of that then comes this kind of need. Well, if the data is spreading out, in order to conquer the data privacy problem, we need a common centralized approach to define these policies and then to be able to enforce them everywhere, whether that's in streaming analytics, in batch, or whatever else. So I hope that gives you an idea as to what I think certainly needs to happen around this particular space. And with that, I'll say thanks very much and hand back to Andy and to Steve. I'll just stop sharing at this point. There we go.
Hi, Mike. Thanks very much for that. For anybody who's hasn't been to one of these before, the presentation is available almost immediately on demand afterwards. So if there's anything that you'd like to see again in Mike's slides, or perhaps you missed the beginning, don't worry, just log back in how you did before and you'll be able to watch it on demand forward and rewind to the right place, that kind of thing. I'd just like to make everybody aware of the attachments tab. You'll see beneath the screen, beneath the videos, there's 3 tabs for questions and attachments. Do check out the attachments. There's some that's going to become more relevant after Steve has spoken now, and also the Big Data London webinar calendar. We've got a lot on over the next few weeks, so we'd be delighted if you could join us for some of those as well. However, I'd like to welcome our next speaker. Over to you, Steve. Thanks, Steve.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. So it's interesting. I've known Mike a long time. I've been in this industry sort of 20 years. I started off doing data warehouses and data marts, and then with Ardent, Essential, and IBM, I ended up going to a mainframe company, so SyncSort, now called Precisely, and then I spent the last 6 years at Cloudera prior to Privitar. So I've got this long history of like building a lot of the products that people use to put all these pieces together. And I realized that all through this, I've really been super aware of the sort of privacy and governance side of this, and it's always been something I return to. So I think one of the key things I want to go through today is how I'm seeing that have an impact through all of these pieces. So Mike mentioned this, but across the enterprise, there are a couple of key initiatives that are driving adoption. So we're seeing cloud migration. It's an unstoppable force. It's the way that all these enterprises are really going in the future. There are some bumps on the road in sort of certain migration points. So most customers are now realizing that you're going to have to go multi-cloud and share your data across. You're also going to have some data that is always going to live on premise. But even customers that I thought would struggle or would never go to the cloud are actually moving there quickly now. Data lakes, whether you want to call them data lakes or swamps or data lake houses, have definitely become an intrinsic part of the architecture. Digital transformation. In the middle of COVID, I had a CIO from a bank down in Australia send me a joke, and it said, "What drove your digital transformation? Your CEO, your CIO, your CDO, or COVID?" And it's certainly interesting to see this mass adoption, but it's been going on for some time, but certainly an acceleration. Data marketplaces. Today, most companies have a sort of black market for data they use internally to drive most of their business decisions. But data marketplaces are becoming the norm, catalogs and others, and integrating into them. There's also some broad sort of usage patterns. So analytics. Data warehouses started many years ago. Most organizations are still struggling with just basic analytics. AI and ML, artificial intelligence seems to happen more in PowerPoint than anything else, but machine learning is certainly being done in code in production environments. And data sharing, the amount of organizations that are realizing that their data is valuable not just to them, but to other organizations. And that idea of monetizing that asset and sharing it, firstly, internally, which is often a struggle in these big companies, but also more importantly, externally. I've seen large organizations take $1 billion cost center, so data they had to keep for regulatory reasons, and realizing that they could actually monetize that and make that cost center not become a profit center, but at least become cost neutral. If you can remove $1 billion cost from your balance sheet, that's never a bad thing. But there are a lot of barriers to how you use safe, efficient, governed data. Mike sort of mentioned some of these, but just to drill into some of them. Data quality, a little bit like dealing with an addiction. First, people have got to admit they have a problem. Everyone has data quality issues. It's sometimes difficult for organizations to accept it or talk about it, but the ability to understand that you do have data quality of data naturally degrades over time. So even if you have perfect data today, it won't be the same tomorrow. And you've got to pick the right data assets. You've got to understand that distributing garbage data around your organization doesn't help you. On the risk side, this is often overlooked. Too many organizations don't fully understand until it's too late the risk of the regulations and laws now. They're changing all the time. So, even China now has a data protection and privacy law that's going to be put into place. You've got to understand how you use data. With customers, when you cross that creepy line where you use a data set around them to go beyond helping them and actually start, being intrinsically, intrusive into their life, when they understand that creepy line, you never get to cross back over. cyber risk is just pervasive. It's not a case of when you're going to get breached, but how badly and how quickly you're going to realize it. In terms of the data itself, one of the customers we spoke to described it as being like a radioactive element, like plutonium. So sensitive data is all across the organization. In small quantities, it's relatively easy to contain and take care of. But in large quantities, it's particularly dangerous. So you have to be very careful about knowing where that data is, how it's being used, and being aware of how it can be linked across your organization. The idea of toxic data, customers linking data together to get information they shouldn't be able to get to. At the end of the day, it is an incredible asset. It is also your biggest liability. And I want you to kind of think about your data footprint for a second. So if you think about all the data you have across your organization today, I've spent a lot of time talking to CEOs and CIOs, and they'll share about the petabytes of data they have across all their organization. But there's all of your data. Then there's the data you're actively using today. So you may have data that you're storing for regulatory reasons. In banks, it's 7 years. There's the data you use today. Then within that, there is sensitive data. It's often the most critical information. It's often the most useful. Then data is the most sensitive. And there are all these business cases that are being driven off that data set today. The issue for you today is a very small subset of that data is privacy compliant today. And the delta between what is compliant today and all of your data that you're storing, that's your risk exposure. Just like you have a threat surface on the cyber side, you have the same on the privacy side. So you've got to think about the value at risk and the privacy implications for that. And when you look at that data, there's a dial between utility and privacy. If you want the maximum utility from a data set, you need it in its raw format. But if you want to achieve the maximum privacy, the best way to protect privacy is to literally delete the columns, the primary and secondary identifiers. But then that data set immediately loses all value. And it's often the most valuable data is when you combine data sets. Well, that's when those key values, those identifiers, are the most useful. So, how do you achieve that trade-off? And it literally is a chart. It's a graph between the two. So max utility with raw data, max privacy with securely deleted data. And how do you trade off between the two? How do you find that balance that's acceptable to your business? Often IT groups see data as this liability. They know they have to store it. They're worried about the legal implications of it. They're keen to keep it in a very controlled way. Then you have the business users who see data as this incredible asset. They can use it to go make a new market, solve a business problem, transform the way they interact with customers. And you have to balance between the two. And that's exactly where we end up playing and solving that problem for them. I also wanted to quickly mention the sort of difference between data security and data privacy. So security is things like perimeter and network security, it's access controls, it's looking at things like, anomaly detection within that data set. Privacy is about looking at the way the data is used, understanding that you will get breached, it will leak in some way, and you have to respond to that. You have to understand how you manage that data when it leaks. You have to abide by the privacy regulations that are unique to city, state, country, use case. You have to understand that most of your breaches are not going to come from intrusion from the outside, but actually from insider threats, compromised credentials, and these complex attacks where they do sort of linkage and differencing are all pieces of that privacy ecosystem. So data privacy complements and strengthens security, but they're very different things. And you can't just look at data security. So I want you to imagine for a second this world that you could live in. So you have 100% of your data instantly available for decision-making across the business. You can monetize those data assets. You can combine data from inside and outside your organization safely, securely, ethically. You can do that with contextualized risk. So you can understand the specific risk of each data asset. If it's a radioactive element, you know exactly where it's stored and what's being done with it. The idea of passports or visas for data as they move through your organization. So, I'm a Brit, but I've lived in the US and move around. So, just like that, my data has a sort of ability to exist in different countries, do different things, and it has to abide by the regulations and rules of that particular country. you want to derive new insights and then feed them back into the system. And you want complete transparency over data use across the lifecycle. You've got those risk and utility metrics across the organization. When your executives come to you and say, what happened here? What are we using this data for? You can show them, you can explain to them how you eliminated those risk factors, how you protected the data, and ultimately how you provided privacy to the end users. And customers and end users now increasingly, through regulations, have the right to come and ask you this question. So this is your chance to get ahead of that. So ultimately, you would like to use 100% of your data safely and ethically across your business and beyond. So this is where we end up sitting. We end up sitting in this kind of crux between the two drawers of utility versus privacy. So the privacy, the platform we've built out has a control layer, so you can basically define policies across the organization. We plug into your favorite discovery tools, your data catalogs and others, the data governance tooling you use. When it comes to execution, batch, real-time, on-demand, all sort of native execution environments, we plug into the cloud providers, so running the various cloud vendors. It's really interesting to see how that's scaling so quickly now. And then you can deliver out these protected data sets that can be delivered into your favorite consumer tool. So I just listed a couple of them there. But this flexible architecture means you can define your policy in one place and then have it consistently enforced across the system. There's some really interesting additional differentiators in there as well. So we allow you to do a full range of DID. So there's a very smart bunch of researchers that are looking at the latest trends in where privacy is going. So as technology evolves, they tend to move from being academic research into implementation to getting surpassed as they either change or evolve. So we can basically plug those privacy enhancing technology pieces in. We have the ability to create use case specific data sets. So when you want to use a data set for a specific use case in a specific country with a specific purpose, you can create that data set and make sure that it's time boxed. It can be used for that purpose and then can even be expired. We do that centralized policy management to provide that ability across the organization to define your policy. Something that's pretty unique to the technology that Privitar built out. So this is all patented, but if you think about how difficult it is to manage your data today as it flows through your organization, you have two choices. One is to try and tie together the metadata from all the different tools from a data governance perspective. But what we let you do is we actually embed a watermark inside the data itself. Imagine you've got a dog and you put a little dog chip in it and the dog sort of runs off. When you find it again, you can scan the chip and see exactly what's going on. This isn't an extra column where we're saying, oh, put this extra data in front of the column. This is a watermark that's hidden inside the data set itself. You can then scan it back in, read it. So if you were to have a data breach and one of your data sets ends up in the outside world, when in your organization today, when someone turns up with their data set and says, this is potentially ours, you first got to see if it's your data set. You've got to trace down where it came from, how it got exposed out, where it left your system. With the watermark, you can literally read it back through, scan out the watermark, go back to the key vault, see who signed off on it, where it was being used, what purpose, when it went through the system, so know exactly how the breach occurred. And that ability to kind of feed that into the data set means it flows through all the tools that you then consume it with downstream. So we built a pretty extensive platform here to use for these operations. Data privacy operations are a subset of data ops that Mike referred to earlier. So increasingly now we're seeing customers plug us into supporting a shop for data workflow, so plugging it into catalogs and other mechanisms. They want to sort of register and ingest metadata from different data governance tools like Calibra and others, and the stack I built at IBM IGC. They want to trust but verify, so they want to look at the data quality, look at the sensitive data classification pieces. They want to apply a range of different, the acronym is PETs, or privacy enhancing technology, to protect that data. So a wide range of different ways of protecting that data set. You've got to plug into all these standard ingestion, consumption, and sharing patterns those customers use. And obviously, you've got to support legacy on-premise architectures and also in the cloud as well. So we do all of those things. And it's a really interesting evolution if you look at where things are going. But the reality is, this is what you want to do today. You want to use that data safely and ethically for those analytics and machine learning use cases, and that's really our sweet spot. That's what we've built out the platform for. And if you look going forward, privacy is this necessary thing that everyone's got to kind of consider as they look at these architectures, and you need to do it not just for the safety of your internal users, but also the customers are increasingly getting aware of how you're using your data set. So they're going to come to you and they have regulations like GDPR where they can literally say, well, what are you doing with my data? How are you protecting me? How is it moving through your system? So privacy is a critical part of that answer. That's it.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. So I'd like to crack on with some questions. Then do keep them coming. Do send some in. The first one's going to be about use cases. We talk about using personal information. What's the most common use cases that you're seeing? I'll put it to you first, Steve, given you're working with people in this area, and then we'll come to you, Mike, afterwards.
So the funny thing about that question is it's every use case. So I spent the last 6 years at Cloudera sort of focused on financial services, and it was pretty much every use case that we came across. It was everything from risk to fraud to financial crime to customer journey. They all involve sensitive data in one way or another. In certain cases, you have the ability to aggregate down, but the reality is if you want to do true, 360-degree view of a customer with a segmentation of one, you're going to need that extra information. So, I think it would be easier to pick use cases which don't require it. But the other thing that's so interesting across these organizations is the way that sort of sensitive data leaks across. So many of the keys that people end up using, the primary and secondary identifiers, all have privacy and security aspects in there. So everything pretty much.
Is that something you'd echo, Mike, in terms of use cases? Pretty much every use.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, obviously, I on the analytical use cases, but without a doubt, a lot of, if you take customer as an example, I think customer is used in so many systems, it flows to so many places. And even if you've got multiple analytical workloads, there were several of them associated with the customer. You've got different data science teams building different kinds of, customer propensity models. So almost everywhere you look, you see the requirement. So it's not like it's just a few here and a few there. It's almost everywhere. And so in that regard, you can't. In this world, all that's going to happen around legislation in this area is just going to get. There's going to be more of it over the next few years. You're going to see more and more countries. As I alluded to in the US, it seems the US is going into, rather than a federal situation, seems to be going into state level situation, which is madness. And but because they're doing that, you can imagine the complexity here. I mean, if you've got to be able to cover these bases, and especially as data moves out across a distributed landscape, even in an analytical environment, that just makes it even harder and harder. If you're expecting to continually chase this data across multiple data stores with an army of administrators trying to create policies locally in every possible data, you get no chance. I mean, in my opinion, what we want is we need centralized policy management. We need to know as it flows, it's already safe. And as Steve said, the watermark idea, gives you traceability. And so in that regard, in a distributed computing environment, distributed data landscape, it's not a nice to have. It's something you got to have.
And just thinking about what you were saying, what I do see is if you look inside Privitar, we've got a policy team. So we've got a group that simply tracks the regulations and looks at how they impact individual organizations. But then so many people probably look at this problem and think, oh, well, I can just DIY. I can build this myself, right? Well, firstly, you've got to pick the right technology. The technology is evolving. You got to map it to the regulations and how it moves through, and then stay on top of it as it evolves. And like you said, I think the idea of organizations being able to define this in a single place and then deploy it, because data across the organization, if you think about the hierarchy of needs, you have data, then you have analytics, you have machine learning, you have AI. It's all built on data, and the way that you link those data sets together is often by the most sensitive data. So yeah,
I think as well, you look at the pressure, as I was trying to allude in my presentation, the pressure that execs are putting on this. They're super keen to get disruptive capability from insights, and at the same time that those same execs are on the hook for as accountable for any breaches or any non-compliance. And so as a result of that, they're kind of you got the people who are working for these execs kind of under pressure to deliver, and you just got to give them this situation where it's safe. I mean, there's no better word for it. Safe is what they need. They want the confidence to move forward with data that is safe, and they want to know as they move forward with it, it remains safe. And especially given the demand for more data and so many more data sources emerging, and the need to join data from one place, even like customer master data, for goodness sake, to almost everything else. I need it in data science. I need it in data warehousing. I need it for streaming analytics. There's just so many places that I need it. And given that the amount of sort of outbound synchronization from a customer master to all of these other places, you've got to be able to protect it. Otherwise you could be inadvertently compromising those projects, and that result in non-compliance all over the place without you even realizing it. So I kind of think this is now a kind of almost a mandatory requirement in organizations in order to give them the confidence to protect the data that they're using.
And we see both sides of that. We see organizations which try and deal with it at the enterprise level, so they want to have a central privacy service. But then increasingly now, projects are just trying to get moving quickly. So we're seeing deployments where they'll just go after a specific use case and make sure that the data is secured and privacy protected inside that use case. And we have this kind of the ability to create like a logical domain of that private data, and then you could follow the life cycle through. So even down to making sure that it expires at a certain point. So yeah, and the nice thing is the way that the product is architected, it plugs into all those existing reporting tools and others. So you can deploy it into Tableau, Click, your favorite reporting layer, or put it in Snowflake, or if you want to deploy to a machine learning tool, plug it into the either the automated tools or the environments, data science environments. So yeah.
And I think as well, there's another aspect to this. The information security team sometimes you see in organizations, and in many cases they're not necessarily anywhere close to the people working on data analytics or even the data engineers, and so they could be off trying to do something locally with a completely different type of software, and so inadvertently leaving doors open behind them. I'm not saying that that's happening, but it could inadvertently happen. And with so much new data coming in, and I certainly don't believe everybody's got a completely managed, policed ingestion setup in most enterprises. As far as I can see, it's almost like lots of people ingesting data from all kinds of places and wanting to then combine it with other data. How many times have I sat in a client and data science says, just get out of my way, let me have all the data. You know what I mean? And so the demand is give them everything. And but if you were to say, well, give you all the data, oh, by the way, you're non-compliant with it, you'd probably drop it like a hot coal, and what they want to be able to do is, they just want confidence. I mean, this is about confidence, it's about governance, it's about safety, and it's about confidence to give people and companies the ability to pursue what they're trying to do from a business objective point of view without inadvertently exposing themselves to unnecessary risk.
Cool. Well, next question is going to be somebody's asking about the first steps to doing this, and I'm going to put a second spin on it. That we talked a little bit about people, so I'll come to that afterwards. They're saying, do they need a data lake? How do they get up and running with this sort of thing? Is this so we'll tackle tech first. What technology do these people need to get up and run?
Well, I'll have a stab at this. Steve can jump in. You'd add more. Feel free as and when you like, Steve. I mean, for me, discovery has got to be one thing. You've got to know where your data is. But I think you've got to also define what is sensitive data, and understand these obligations and these regulations and legislation out there, and be able to clarify completely what particular data is absolutely considered sensitive, and then the discovery process can kick in with allowing you to know what you're looking for. If you do discovery without knowing what you're looking for, you're kind of wandering around a sea of data that's being discovered. So I kind of think you've got to look at it from that angle. And then, a lot of companies are already well down this track with the appointment of data privacy officers and initiatives around this. And I think do understand that the bigger challenge for them is, once you understand it, it's then identifying, well, where exactly is it out there in a array of different data stores. I think once you get that underway, then the ability to start tackling it and ensuring that the protection of the data is happens, if you like, is the second step. Is there anything you think I should add to that, Steve?
No, I was going to be sort of somewhat sarcastic in my response, having built data governance tools and all that. Like, just go to your data governance catalog, right, and look up, because it's got a perfect view across your organization of where all your data is, and you just click on, show me all the sensitive stuff, right? I think the reality is that many of the sort of tools out there that people have been struggling to deploy for some time, because they've had such issues with the implementation of them, like there isn't that perfect place of knowing where all that data is today. So you've got to, discovery is a good step to kind of begin with, but you also to some degree where the most critical data is, because it's the systems you use most regularly, and it's the systems that you're combining stuff with. So there's a danger that people look at this too academically, and I've seen that the customers who move the fastest and have the most success just get on and start working through it. So don't be overly academic in the way you look at this. Just start moving quickly and look at specific projects. For many years, the policy around any of these, like building a data lake, the idea is think big, start smart, iterate often. So start small and iterate often. It's no different with privacy. Don't necessarily just look, just at the enterprise level. Look at specific projects, move quickly around those. So, and you don't need anything, to get started. If you've got data, then you've probably got a privacy problem that you need to start looking at. So, if you've got, that's the one minimum requirement.
Yeah, and I think as well, on the discovery side, we all just assume discovery, is going to spot everything, but not all discovery tools look at all sources. You know what I mean? How much sensitive data is sitting in Excel spreadsheets, in attachments in your email system, for goodness sakes. So there's a whole range of places where this could exist, and so obviously when you're doing this, you need to make sure that the sources that, as Steve said, that you're using regularly, that those sources are covered as far as discovery is concerned. But yeah, I totally agree. You've got to you've got to be able to you need tools to help you quickly identify it. But I think as well, it's the policies around it, but creating those centrally and getting away from chasing the tail of this with an army of administrators trying to keep them sort of synchronized every time something going to change is needed. Or we forgot this or we forgot that, and before you know it, you're trying to constantly resync everybody and get their policies right across so many places. It's just becoming far too manually intensive, and prone to error that we need some better ways of doing it.
Yeah, and I'm going to make this the last question, but put a secondary spin on the question rather than technology. We mentioned a couple of other departments and other disciplines, really. Skills-wise, if not hiring people, who needs to be in this conversation? I mean, you mentioned the InfoSec team. Do you need to be speaking to them about this? Other teams, governance teams, or if you're looking to increase the capabilities of your team, or at least tell people that they need to not just think about like you say, just getting at the data. What other things do they need to at least have on their mind if you're not bringing in new staff or new skills? I'll go with you, Mike, first.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think for me, obviously, you've got to look at this from an organizational perspective as well. I mean, I think companies can't afford to say, oh, it's up to those guys or it's up to those guys. I mean, and I think there's no question that as companies go forward, and I think this is beginning to happen. They're beginning to realize that everyone using the data across the organization is responsible for it. But I do think we are definitely making people accountable for it now, and as a result, I think the other thing that's going on is the infrastructure team, often in a corner of IT, is kind of being dragged into the bigger data governance umbrella, where governance could also include data quality, it could include data retention and access security. And so I think all of this is coming under one umbrella, and perhaps with a CDO, or as we saw in the latest Fourth Industrial Revolution survey, we've seen a rise of the DPO, now data privacy officer. It really, a year ago when we did the survey, DPO was barely on the radar. Now here we are a year later. Was it something like 20%? I think of the respondees on the survey indicated that DPO now has got a significant role, and so yes, there's more and more of that kind of, a person is made accountable and is paid to make sure this is enforced correctly across the organization. You've got to bring these elements together. Can't have people living in their fiefdoms and just saying, well, it's those guys over the wall there. And I think as far as executives are concerned, considering the seriousness of this going forward, there's no question cybercrime and everything like that is a super high priority in the boardroom. And I think they're doing, they want to make sure that it's a collective responsibility across the organization, with, of course, a formal organizational structure around accountability.
Yes, and final word for you, Steve, I guess, in terms of skills and considerations for teams. What are you seeing? What are you thinking? And who's doing it? People who are doing it well, what are they doing?
So I think some of the skills on the technology side do exist in the existing data teams. I think what's interesting now is to really do a good job of this and to make sure that you're giving your execs the get out of jail free card from Monopoly style. You need to really understand the legal implications. So it involves a conversation between lots of different teams. It involves the compliance team, the legal team. You are going to have to tie into the data governance org extensively. You're going to have to tie into the individual application developers across your org in general. Everyone is effectively a guardian for the data set they're curating, whether they realize it or not. So it does involve that larger group, and it's the collaboration of them and getting them to just, what we do find is defining a policy allows you to kind of put into a repeatable, consumable format the sort of, the technical implementation of something that's stuck in people's heads. We were chatting with a customer the other day, and they were, there are regulations about how they use a data set that came in from the outside within their organization. Only certain groups can use it in a certain way. And, that's stuck in people's heads. So it's a data governance problem as well. So the ability to take all that out of people's heads and sort of blend it into a product and make it repeatable and shareable is kind of the key thing here. So, yeah, I think you have the skill sets internally to some degree, but it's more making sure people understand the implications.
Perfect. Well, it's been a pleasure to speak to you both today. I've enjoyed that one. It's been a very interesting and distinct topic to the ones that we've been having recently. So it's been great to discuss it. I'd like to thank you on behalf of all the audience. So thanks very much, Steve. Thank you very much, Mike. And we'll hope to see you again shortly. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Oh, cheers.
Have a good day. Thanks.